Thank you, Richard. And maybe, if it's not getting a bit too ahead of ourselves, maybe thank you, Richard, for the last 10 years as well, Professor Richard Clegg. Yeah, go on, yeah. Once every 10 years, it's worth an extra ripple of applause, I think. So as Richard said, lots of things there. So we'll be coming back to the things we saw in those videos. We'll be coming back to decarbonisation, to safer future oceans, to enhanced engineering skills. We'll be coming back to data-centric engineering. We'll be coming back to seaweed, which people seem to be obsessed with, but I love it myself as well. But we're going to start with something Richard said a lot about. We had some great statistics there about there are 121 countries watching us today. Thank you, particularly those who are watching us in the middle of the night. But I've also got some grim statistics. The better part of 1 billion documented cases, well over 6 million deaths, all manner of other scary statistics, and we are far from done with it yet. The pandemic has touched all of us, radically changed our ways of life in the short term, and substantially affected them in the long term, robbed us of relatives and friends, and utterly undermined our sense of being in control and above nature. But not everything about COVID-19 is bad news. We've seen unprecedented coordinated responses, unparalleled collaboration across borders, unmatched cooperation between science and governance. It's tested the old proverb, necessity is the mother of invention to breaking point and beyond, and yet it's pretty much held good. So what have we learned since the outbreak began? What have we had to unlearn? And how are we going about making the world a safer place as we try to put the COVID outbreak behind us? As Richard said, this is our big COVID bounce back. So which way do we want to bounce and how do we do it? We've got 3 keynotes all looking at different aspects of what's happened, what we need to do now, what we need to do next. And we're going to begin with Dr. Cleopatra Doumbia-Henry, President of the World Maritime University. In case you've not run into it before, this is a university established within the framework of the International Maritime Organization. Now, I promise to keep the intro short. There is much more about all the speakers available via the conference website, but I will say Cleopatra, hugely experienced international lawyer, global leader on international law, advocate for sustainability and innovation, and is in the Lloyd's list of the top 100 people in shipping. So what perspective does that background give her on the pandemic, what we've done, and where we go next? The first of our COVID keynote trio, Dr. Cleopatra Doumbia-Henry.
Secretary General, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as President of the World Maritime University, it gives me great pleasure to address you today. As we all know, the COVID-19, and you've just indicated, the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly impacted everything that we do, including our normal way of life. Hopefully, the worst part in relation to the pandemic, we all hope, is soon over. And the world has adapted with certain resilience practices in relation to the new paradigm shift that we must take forward. It is also true that COVID has disrupted business modalities and patterns that were prevailing until the multi-dimensional crisis came along, disrupting the assumptions and the conditions we had previously anticipated. In the recent past, we extensively resorted to solutions like social distancing, online meeting, which we are gaining in popularity and becoming the protagonists of our everyday interaction. It is therefore a privilege for me to be able to be here today, the first visit outside of my own university in Malmö because of the pandemic, to address such a distinguished audience in the ordinary face-to-face modality. I believe that it is very clear to every one of us in this room that the global supply chain continues to be affected by the challenges relating to the pandemic, including the delays and the disruptions. The supply chain turmoil can be viewed as a very important threat to companies' growth and the economies of countries, particularly the developing countries. As a result, organizations need to reimagine and manage their supply chain differently in order to ensure business continuity and the growth for the future. With well over 2 years into this pandemic, the global supply chain continues to sputter and to break down. So we still have a long way to go to back to what I think will be a new normal. Every day comes of news of choked ports, and this is happening since the pandemic. Out of place shipping containers, record freight rates, and other problems that cause disruptions and defy easy answers. But there is also some good news. To begin with, concerned actors have, as at the starting point, adopted new supply chain risk management practices over the past year, including diversifying to reduce over-resilience and over-reliance on the regions that are still troubled by the impact of COVID-19, with, for example, China standing out today. Before the pandemic, cost reduction and productivity enhancement were driving supply chains and the processes that move them forward with respect to improvements, digitalization, and investment. Those drivers remain important, but the unprecedented chaos caused by the COVID threatened the competitive position, even, I would say, the survival of many businesses that found that they could no longer meet customer expectations. The existential crisis brought on by the pandemic has, in reality, forced companies to shift their focus of innovation and restructuring, and these efforts to ensure business continuity by building resilience and flexibility. More importantly, certain forward-looking companies, and we all heard what has just been said to us by our earlier speaker. Certain forward-looking companies are not waiting for supply lines to simply untangle themselves. Retailers short on storage space are buying or creating their own warehouses. Shippers that cannot find containers are similarly making their own, while those unhappy with their online sales are buying e-commerce fulfillment operators as an alternative. It is clear that the supply chain is experiencing an unfortunate series of firsts. Indicative examples include, but are not limited to, a historic level of carrier unreliability, record high freight rates, all-time low warehouse vacancies, and more. All these will pass, and when it does, we should all be on the lookout for a more intelligent and well-digitized supply chain. From another perspective, I would like to draw attention to the United Nations framework for immediate socio-economic response to the COVID-19 crisis. As we all know, the pandemic is far more than a health crisis. It is affecting societies and economies at the very core. While the impact of the pandemic will vary from country to country, it will most likely increase poverty and inequalities, and I wish to highlight this, on a global scale, making the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals even more urgent. Assessing the impact of COVID-19 on societies, economies, and vulnerable groups is fundamental to inform and tailor the responses of governments and partners to recover from the crisis and ensure that no one is left behind. No country is left behind. Without urgent socioeconomic responses, global suffering will escalate, jeopardizing lives and livelihoods for years to come. Immediate development responses in this crisis must be undertaken with an eye to the future. Development trajectories in the long term will be affected by the choices that countries make, that they make now, that they make today, and support that they will receive. It is also true that COVID-19 has quickly spread in all latitudes and longitudes of the earth. It has taken a significant number of lives. It has stirred anxiety, overwhelmed health systems, and triggered intensive political debates and potentially lasting geopolitical change. At the same time, a global slump in demand for goods, which was a direct result of lockdowns that we all experienced over more than 2 years. The response to the coronavirus implications created a negative ripple effect on all major sectors, including shipping. However, even by factoring in the numerous challenges that has been created due to COVID-19, the maritime sector still remains one of the most important of today's global economy. Acting as the backbone of world trade, approximately 80 to 90% of goods and raw materials are served today by the international shipping industry. The shipping industry's capacity to transfer goods and materials from the point where they are produced to where they will be ultimately consumed literally underpins the way of modern life. It is anticipated that certain discussions in relating to countries' self-reliance have already been initiated because of the recent disruption in the global supply chain as part of the response with respect to the pandemic. The recent developments in relation to Ukraine will bring the issue of energy security as a focus of attention. However, it is necessary to clearly highlight the fact that shipping is standing out in relation to all other modes of transport, and this for 3 main reasons. The first is that shipping allows countries to access raw materials needed to develop their economies. Second, it enables the manufacture and export of affordable goods and products. And thirdly, it has the lowest environmental impact in the transport segment on a per ton basis. But we mustn't take that for granted. We still have a lot to do in shipping to reduce our footprint. The wider shipping industry helps to ensure that the benefits of trade and commerce are more evenly spread around the world, since no country is entirely self-sufficient, and every country relies on maritime trade to sell what it has available or what it has produced on its own and buy what it needs. It is also true that we are introducing more and more digital applications. That's the modern world, the world of our children. It is, sorry, much still remains to be done, but if we continue to use and consume in our everyday lives everything that we see and everything that we want, we will be going in the wrong direction. But shipping continues to be the most important form of transport, in that the raw materials that we depend on, the components or finished articles that we need, remain indispensable with shipping. The jobs and the livelihoods of billions of people in the developing world and the standards of living in the industrialized and developed world clearly continue to heavily depend on ships and shipping. Shipping has played an important part in the dramatic improvements of global living standards that have taken millions of people out of acute poverty in recent years. It will, however, be just as critical for the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030, a plan of the United Nations agreed upon by all global leaders revolving around the 5 Ps: people, peace, planet, prosperity, and partnership. I'd like to emphasize that the importance of shipping in supporting and sustaining today's global society makes it indispensable to the world, as well as meeting the challenge of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. On a positive side, the call for immediate action on the part of all countries, organizations, and individuals to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. Of particular relevance to the maritime and ocean fields are those goals relating to climate change and the emission of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants. There is a clear need to highlight the UN SDG 7, which is focused on affordable, reliable, and sustainable modern energy for all. This important initiative is complemented by the United Nations Development Goal 13, which is focused on urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. It is therefore not a coincidence that the World Maritime University is strongly committed to UN SDG 13 and has intensified our efforts to support the achievement and of sustainable, energy-efficient maritime and ocean industries. Let me take the opportunity to wish all participants a very fruitful event, and I look forward to the engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to remember that. People, peace, prosperity, planet, partnership. I remember that. Multidimensional problem. I remember that. And I really like the delineation of the multiple ways that shipping can enable that. Now, I would normally encourage you to chip in on shipping, but we don't have time for that with our keynote speakers. And I would normally have loved to hear more and just say carry on Cleo, but we do not have time. But we do have to get straight onto our second COVID keynote, which is Theo Demoulas. Yes, we have a Cleo, then a Theo. It's almost like we've planned this, except the plan hasn't worked out perfectly because Theo, unfortunately, has got a bad cold, so he's joining us virtually rather than being with us in the flesh. Theo is Professor of Machine Learning and Data Science at the University of Warwick. recent recipient of a coveted UKRI Turing AI Fellowship, and as of last year is group leader in the Lloyd's Register Foundation's Data-Centric Engineering program at the Alan Turing Institute here in London. I did say we'd be getting more on data engineering, but what can data engineering tell us about the data of COVID? Please welcome on screen Professor Theo Demoulas.
Hello everyone, good morning, and I hope you are enjoying your first day at the Safer World Conference, and my apologies for not being able to be there in person. It's been a few weeks since we've been fighting with this cold. It seems 2 years of isolation is not helping antibodies much. So I'd love to tell you today about our COVID response project, codenamed Odysseus, that started in the early days of the pandemic as it was unfolding across the UK. The team behind Project Odysseus, we were working for roughly 3 years before the pandemic started in developing the urban digital twin for London for air pollution. And in order to actually understand air pollution, you can imagine that you need a very good understanding of human activity in the city. So what happened was, when the pandemic started, we approached our partners, which are the policymakers in the City of London, so Greater London Authority and Transport for London. And as a team, we volunteered and said, what can we do, given our experience, data sources, algorithms and knowledge, to help policy, to help the city. And this is how our work was pivoted and Project Odysseus was born. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bird's eye view of one of the main outputs of our COVID response project. When we approached the city, they basically said, we need to understand busyness. We need to understand near real time the human activity in the city across multiple modalities so that we can actually drive interventions and improve, for example, social distancing, improve and the economic recovery of the city, and understand what is happening during these crucial times across the capital. What you see on the image is one of the dashboards, one of the main outputs of Project Odysseus, and one of the main streaming live data sources that we've built upon. These are roughly 1,000 cameras, publicly available, publicly accessible cameras, low-resolution cameras across the road network in London. These are the so-called JamCam cameras. And they are color-coded based on, in this specific example, the number of vehicles, the number of cars, a specific type of vehicle, that has been detected from that live streaming camera using our deep learning, machine learning algorithms that are operating on these streams. And they're counting the number of vehicles and also the number of different types of vehicles and, as we will see, also human pedestrians. This provides a direct feed for policymakers to be able to understand one aspect of busyness across London. And you see on the right part of the figure some of these counts, in this specific case of cars, and how they're changing in time for this one specific location that has been picked up across these 1,000 camera locations. Next, please. This is not the only view, and this is not, of course, the only output that we've been providing for the policymakers. You can see here the same view, but overlaying on top of that TomTom data across the road network in London, and also a kind of deeper look inside of one of the cameras and effectively one of the algorithms operating on these video streams, that is not only detecting different objects in the scene, such as vehicles of different types and human pedestrians, but it's actually estimating social distancing between human pedestrians. So you see there in the red boxes, these distances being computed. Imagine this happening near real time across these 1,000 locations and being able then to quantify things like the group size of pedestrians, the average social distancing, and how that valuable information can help policymakers drive some of the interventions that we've actually seen in London. Next slide, please. So why busyness? Why is this, and why was that a crucial concept for Greater London Authority and Transport for London? And remember that this was not something that we were looking at. This was pivoting of a project directly based on the needs of the city. So understanding human activity and busyness as much as you can is very important, of course, for interventions. Specifically, GLA and TfL were looking for information to guide interventions such that they can understand the effects to economic activity, things like footfall, to drive interventions directly during that period in terms of pavement extensions. I'm sure a lot of you who have been or visited London during those times, I guess visit maybe not very frequently then, but you've seen some of those pavement extensions and road interventions. Some of those were targeted to increase the capacity for social distancing, if you want, so that pedestrians would be safer. And of course, a main, beyond kind of the initial phase of the pandemic, a main policy intervention goal is the recovery of the city. So how fast the city is recovering, how much is human activity back to normal levels or pre-COVID levels? How is that changing across space? Are there different areas that are recovering slower or faster, and why so? Apart from these main direct policy guidelines, we've also produced three main outputs, if you want. So the first one is an early warning system based on all of these modalities. What is happening that seems anomalous in a way? Is there events happening? Being able to monitor, thousands of sensor networks and terabytes of streaming data, and be able to understand specific spatiotemporal locations in the city that an event is happening, something unexpected compared to what we know from the past is happening. The second one is an end-to-end, as you've seen, pedestrian density and social distancing system to inform policymaking for safer distancing and for safer behavior across the city, and also to understand economic recovery. And the third one is to protect vulnerable individuals with route planning methodology, route planning algorithms that are operating on top of these streams. To give you an example, and we'll see that towards the end, if you have a good understanding across the city and across time of what are the average, for example, social distancing metrics and the average human density, you can create safer routes for vulnerable peoples that avoid congested areas, that avoid areas that have become bottlenecks, and impose effectively a small social distancing region. Next, please. Of course, a main interest post-pandemic is to understand the effects of interventions. We know, and you see here on the figure, some of these interventions, citywide interventions, when they started, how long they lasted. And of course, having all of that information beside us, we can now see the effect of that to things like footfall, to things like social distancing, to things like the average group sizes. and we see those effects and how they're relating to socioeconomic factors across the city and the differences. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the really nice and really new thing about our kind of research strategy here was that this project was not born out of a drive for academic research, for fundamentals. This was a project born out of necessity, as previous speakers mentioned. And that meant that we had to pivot all of the infrastructure that we had developed over the last years for air pollution and for some of these transportation and traffic sources that we were using, and pivot that to Project Odysseus, to understand business. And this was one of the main benefits, that having a modular infrastructure that, as we have developed, that was something that we could do very fast. We could react very, very fast. I won't go into the detail of the infrastructure, but just to say it's a cloud-based infrastructure, very modular. We have our data streams and our APIs providing information to the policymakers without them having to deal with all of the nitty-gritty details in terms of data processing, some of these huge data sources. They can directly extract through the API or the dashboard information viable for decision making. Next slide, please. You've actually seen some of these information. If you remember in government announcements and from the chief scientific officer, you've seen aggregate views of activity across the city and how different interventions were driving activity in the city, of course, to decline in terms of traffic when only very specific activity was permitted. But of course, here we have a much more, we have a real-time, near real-time view and a much more granular view at a very local level. So going from a city to a borough to actually very local, hyper-local resolution is one of the key components here. Understanding mobility and activity in that space, and in order to assist, as we said, both health planning, epidemiologists as inputs to some of the models, and policymakers for driving interventions in the city. Next slide, please. A second data source, but really kind of the first modality that we've tackled, was based on some of the streaming data sources that we had from Transfer from London, which these are the loop detectors across the road network in London. Roughly around 11,000 of those. You see them in the figure, and they are used effectively together with models to count vehicles passing by over these loop detectors. So they measure kind of the occupancy across the road network. Based on this data source that we already had integrated into our system, in the next slide, we will see some of the output of the machine learning algorithms effectively. And just to give you an intuition of what is happening here, this is only one of the 11,000 sensors, and it's a time series. So it's a segment, it's a small segment in time for that sensor. And in the lighter colored dots, so in the green and blue dots, you see normal activity. So pre-COVID pandemic activity from that sensor. And then in the shaded bands and the middle solid line is actually a model that is fitted to that data to effectively create an expectation of what is normal for that sensor. Now, having an understanding of the expected behavior of activity in one spatial location, we can then use this model to actually detect deviations. So counts of vehicles that are extremely high or extremely low compared to this expectation. And this is what you see with the red dots. So these are times inside for this spatial location, where the count, for example, of pedestrians or of vehicles of specific type are extremely low and very unlikely under a normal scenario. So there are valuable lessons and valuable information here for building an alarm system, but also understanding the expected profile across the expected activity across the city for economic recovery. Next slide, please. A bit furthermore on the event detection component of this. Now think beyond one location in space. Let's take an area in London and consider now, well, I don't want to be fooled by just, one event looking a bit anomalous in one sensor location. I want to be talking about a cluster of events, because that is of highest priority. Is there a cluster emerging of anomalous behavior in an area? To prioritize for policymakers which effectively spatiotemporal areas in London and neighborhoods in London to look at specifically. And this is what's happening with this system. It's detecting emerging spatiotemporal clusters based on the models and the process I described previously. And through that, it guides road network interventions for the pandemic. So we identify areas now that are consistently different. They're defining an event of interest that we want to target with an intervention. Next slide, please. The second one is what you've seen already. This is the JamCam cameras. These are publicly available resolution cameras, and we have a rolling ethical review from Turing to ensure there is no privacy concerns and there is no identifiable information, both from the data sources coming in, but also from the API and the outputs that we produce. Next slide, please. Again, another view, a more detailed view of the dashboard and what's happening under the hood. Of course, in order to detect objects, you have to understand the topology, that the scene, the depth of the scene, the geography of the scene, and there are various developments that we had to do in order to calibrate and be able to extract information from data. This is based on state-of-the-art deep learning models, optimized processing. We're talking about massive amounts of data. So daily we're processing about 220 video files, so about 25 gigabytes per daily basis. There are various state-of-the-art methods to calibrate and transfer learning across these models, including edge detection, geotagging, and even remote sensing information that helps us understand the scene, the 3D scene, to be able to do that. Next slide, please. Again, some of the outputs, as you've seen, social distancing and group sizes, and of course, counting the targets in the vehicles, buses, cars, motorbikes. But through that, we can compute densities. And that's what you see on the left figure. These are pedestrian densities across the scene. And therefore, you can see areas that are of high density. And at the same time, you can therefore understand the volume of pedestrians with, for example, areas that might be problematic with very small social distancing. Next slide, please. This is giving you an example across 6 different scenes where you can see kind of pavement densities and also pedestrian densities crossing when crossing the road. So this is, of course, use to the city beyond the pandemic and for understanding footfall, for safety, understanding problematic areas where pedestrians cross. You can imagine that this is actually a very valuable piece of information in near real time across the city. But focusing again on the COVID response. Next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Just to close up with the third main output. As I mentioned, this is optimizing routes. And if we can click again, this should be an animation. So you should see with this blue dot, this red route expanding. You can imagine that this is a spatial slice and the color depicting, for example, risk in terms of COVID. So it could be social distancing combined with the density. And you have a vulnerable person. Let's say, imagine this scenario where we want to construct a route. So we want to a tour effectively. So starting, let's say, from their home and return back, that is safe in that context. And of course, what the information is, what the information used to construct this risk depends on the specific scenario and the specific setting. You can imagine this is applicable to things like even air pollution, which was the original motivation here. You know, cycling and routing to minimize your exposure to air pollution. But in this case, is to minimize your exposure effectively to COVID. All of these have very deep and very interesting research questions that are open. Some of these problems are very hard to solve optimally, and this drives our also research in the future. So in closing, I hope I gave you a good overview of Project Odysseus, and I'll give you some concluding remarks. So this was really a mission-driven research. My group, I went around the group and basically asked, you know, who would like to volunteer in this project, because, you know, the target was not to do pure academic research, was actually to help the city. And the group responded enthusiastically and came in, and it was really fantastic. I'd like to thank the support from for the Lloyd from the Lloyd's Register Foundation, and also the Warwick Impact Award that helped fund this project in the early beginnings, and of course the Alan Turing Institute that also supported us on this. This was direct pathway to impact. It was driven by the policymakers, and at every step across this road, we had, as I mentioned, a rolling ethical review at the Alan Turing Institute, and to ensure privacy preserving processing and information coming in and information coming out, and of course the security of the APIs in the systems. I'll close by saying that this work led to more than 700 interventions in the City of London, so across London during the C-19 pandemic. And I have the quote there. So these enabled interventions to very quickly identify problematic areas, so street spacing interventions, moving bus stops, widening pavements, as I mentioned, and closing park bays. And a lot of that had to do with enabling better social distancing for pedestrians across the city. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the conference, and I'll be virtually interacting with you during the conference. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you to all of the collaborators and people working on this project across these last 3 years.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you, Professor Theo Demoulas. I hope the cold gets better. And as Michael Corleone, Al Pacino says in The Godfather, it's not personal, it's strictly busyness. Well, he nearly says that. We have a bit of busyness ourselves, so we're going to move straight on to the third and final member of our COVID keynote trio. And it is from Seth Schultz, Executive Director of Resilience Rising. Now, you can be forgiven if you've not heard of Resilience Rising. They're a relatively new Lloyd's Register Foundation-funded non-profit consortium working to accelerate, incubate, and coordinate all aspects of creating a safer, smarter, and more sustainable future fit for all. But I'm sure Seth, who's long been entangled with various leading organizations across climate change and sustainable development, will not only tell us more, but tell us how the pandemic has affected their ideas and action. Our final COVID keynote is from Seth Schultz.
Thank you. Hello. as introduced, my name is Seth Schultz, and I am the CEO of an organization called Resilience Rising. I have to say, it's an incredible venue. You guys have outdone yourself, but I'm a little disappointed you couldn't go that extra mile and get maybe like a theme song for Cleo, Theo, and myself. I think Richard might be cutting some corners on the way out. It's not a pretty look, Richard. We'll have to talk to Ruth about this. Kidding aside, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. We haven't got to do a lot of these, as Cleo was mentioning, in person, and it's really special to be here with all of you, and I'm very grateful to the Lloyd's Register Foundation for the invitation to speak with you about all the work that we've been doing together on resilience. As you might have heard earlier from Richard, this conference marks the 10-year anniversary of the foundation, but today also marks the conclusion of a really bold and innovative grant that the foundation made 5 years ago, when, in partnership with Arup, a large global engineering firm, it created an initiative called Resilient Shift, which in turn has just led to the creation and the launch of a new organization called Resilience Rising. I'd like to pause for just a quick minute and ask all the people in the room who've been part of this journey over the last 5 years to just quickly stand up. From board members to partners to consortium members, could you please stand up? Thank you. One of my favorite quotes is an African proverb, and it says, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And we've gone far fast. And over the next couple of days, please reach out to any of the colleagues that you've just seen and talk about the remarkable project that we've been working on. Thank you. So today I want to share the story of how this organization came to be, our journey from ideation to implementation, and why I think resilience is essential in order to ensure a safe and prosperous future for our society moving forward. So by way of a brief introduction and background, I have a degree in environmental science and geology, and I spent the first 10 years of my career working in the engineering community. This was over in the US, and most of the work I did was environmental remediation, hazardous waste, air, water, soil, mostly public sector clients, cities, state government, federal government. But it was fantastic because I got a very deep appreciation of the complex and interconnected jungle of infrastructure that allows society to work. Over the course of my time working in that space, I migrated more and more to emergency response. And I'm proud to have worked and helped supported some of the most devastating disasters that have hit the US in the last 20 years. Some of that work included working down at Ground Zero in the cleanup after 9/11, and some of it was cleaning up after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. But over time, I started to get burned out from this work. I got more and more frustrated with the reactive nature. I started getting angry at having to clean up other people's pollution. I got tired of picking up broken homes and trying to rebuild devastated communities. So as a result, I pivoted. And I moved into the not-for-profit space, looking for a way to try to be more proactive in some of these issues, and I'm so glad I did. I've had the unbelievably good fortune over the last 15 years of working with presidents, governors, mayors, billionaires, activists, scientists, and CEOs all over the world. The work that I've been focusing on is really kind of focused on 4 major megatrends. Those are globalization, urbanization, climate change, and the 4th industrial revolution. I want to dive in maybe just to 2 of those for an example to kind of highlight some of the speed and the scale of the impacts of these megatrends. Let's take urbanization first. So increasingly, we're living in a very urban world, and it's now estimated by mid-century, 7 in 10 people are going to be living in cities. Now, to put that in perspective, that means between now and 2050, roughly 1.5 million people per week are moving into cities around the world. Another way I try to describe this, it's the largest mammal migration in the history of the planet, and it's human beings moving from rural to urban areas. All right, now let's talk about climate change for a minute. You may have seen there's another big report came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And as usual, it's pretty stark reading. It's not great because the time frame with which we have to act to reduce emissions is getting compressed. Basically, what the report outlines is that the society needs to decarbonize by mid-century, by 2050. And in order for that to happen, we have to peak our global emissions by 2030. That is now in 8 years. The Secretary General of the UN just recently referred to this report as a code red for humanity. Now, on top of this, the interconnected nature of these megatrends and the speed with which they are occurring is exacerbating the level of uncertainty we face both now and well into the future. It demands a holistic, systemic approach to understand how to become resilient to it. But systemic change can be overwhelming. But the world is at a pivot. We are living through a decisive decade in human history, and our world is changing in fundamental ways. The foundational systems that underpin society, technological, human, and ecological, are increasingly becoming more interdependent. But they've become fragile due to fragmented governance and insufficient investment and are now operating in an increasingly uncertain future. You see, I'm becoming increasingly worried that if we had all the political will, all the money we needed, all the technology and all the know-how, we cannot accomplish the task in front of us. I'll let that sink in for a minute. We have run out of time. To accomplish the task at hand, we cannot apply the same set of rules, processes, standards, and methods if we are to succeed. We also have to accept that this decade of change is the most pivotal, and if we look at what needs to happen in order to accomplish the task at hand, then we must accept that radical partnership, innovation, failure, and adaptability must be the tools in our toolkit. The late American futurist Alvin Toffler had a great quote that I'd like to share, and he said, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but rather those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." Now, as a quick primer to some of you who may not be familiar with resilience, it's basically the ability to withstand, adapt, and/or to transform for a positive outcome to a shock or stress. Now, it's a complicated topic, as Richard mentioned, diving into these knotty issues, and it includes interconnected approaches, integrated systems, cascading failures, and dynamic solutions. And as a result, you may not be surprised to hear that our understanding of resilience and its practical application is far behind where it needs to be. The Lloyd's Register Foundation came to this very conclusion in 2015 when they conducted an insight report on the resilience of engineering. From this research came the idea to create a dedicated initiative to take forward this issue and accelerate the work, and the foundation invested a £10 million grant over 5 years. And in a somewhat provocative move, they awarded it to Arup. Arup is a large global engineering firm with a focus on sustainability and infrastructure. It was quite interesting because instead of looking for answers in academia or a think tank, they were looking for answers on where this is being practiced, where it's getting implemented. And it was a very innovative decision, and I think it paid off. Arup was up to the task and quickly created an independent entity or brand called Resilient Shift, which set out to become the go-to source for high quality and influential advice on all matters related to the resilience of infrastructure systems. Now, over the same period of time, there's been no halt in resilience-related events, whether it's the massive flooding in Germany, forest fires across the west coast of the US, forest fires in Australia, the grid going down in Texas, we could go on. Such crises and disasters, whatever their cause, continue to demonstrate the critical need to build ongoing resilience of infrastructure systems and services. But right in the middle of this 5-year kind of journey with Resilient Shift, COVID happened. And when the pandemic took hold in early 2020, an interesting thing occurred. Suddenly, there was an explosion in terms of the awareness of resilience. Search traffic for the word resilience rose to an all-time high on the Google search engine, eclipsing more predominant terms usually searched for, such as sustainability and climate. So when COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic and its impacts were seen to spread and grow over a matter of mere weeks, my colleagues and I stopped everything we were doing and sat down to reflect on what we should do, similar to many of you in the organizations around the world. And we basically came up with 3 options. 1, we pause our work. How can we deliver on the strategic objectives that we had laid out, given the unprecedented nature of what was happening? Number two, we swerve. We take the things that we had been planning to do, we put them on the back burner, and we try to focus on the things that were bubbling up in front of us. And option three, which is the one we ended up going for, was to lean into the uncertainty and to consider COVID-19 as a potential opportunity for learning about global crises and the transformation that occurs coming out of crises. And as a result, we doubled our efforts. Now, often when I talk about resilience, particular climate resilience, we tend to think about how we recover from a physical impact, like a storm or a flood, which can damage the infrastructure, systems as an example. But because there was no physical damage in the case of COVID in that sense, we were able to isolate and examine the importance of the human part of the system, how we behaved, the decisions we make, and how we lead through that time of crisis. The project we ended up developing was called Resilient Leadership: Learning from Crisis. And we looked at leadership through the lens of the COVID crisis and used a reflective learning method in the form of real-time conversations, rather than looking back afterwards, when hindsight often tells us a very different story. So the concept was simple. What if we could listen in to different leaders around the world as they went through their daily thought process during the crisis? It took us a mere 14 days to go from the original concept to having a team in place, assembled, and a project being initiated. We ended up assembling 12 different leaders. 5 were CROs, or Chief Resilience Officers, in a partnership with the Resilient Cities Network. 7 of these leaders were senior executives of large global corporations or companies. We spoke to them for 30 minutes a week over the course of 16 weeks, right through the middle of dealing with the initial onset of COVID. Now, asking 12 leaders to take 30 minutes every week during probably the most challenging personal and professional period of their lives was a pretty audacious ask. But fortunately for us and for them, they agreed to do it. COVID and this project was a major turning point for us in our journey, not just because of the insights that we gained from the project, but it made us realize that we as an organization needed to lean into the uncertainty ahead of us and practice bold, courageous collaboration. Some of the other things that were really fascinating that came out of this project was seeing in real time how different leaders make different decisions. And in this case, we had 5 cities around the world, which were in one specific place, as well as 7 companies who had multiple offices in multiple places around the world. And the other thing that's interesting from a resilience and a shock and stress perspective with regard to COVID is most, when we talk about disasters, are very acute, they're very intense. It's a hurricane, it's a flood, and it happens in usually a pretty short period of time and in a very specific place. COVID was a slow onset disaster. And it was really interesting to see what happened compared to a city in one place versus a company had multiple offices, and to see what a city was doing with regard to protecting the public well-being and citizens versus companies who were protecting employees and shareholders. We were also able to learn the difference between CROs, these Chief Resilience Officers who had deep experience in resilience, versus CEOs who didn't have that deep experience but were very good decision makers. And the processes and the insights as we shared learning in real time so that we started seeing the behavior of proactive decision making over the course of 16 weeks. And it was amazing. And some of the CEOs we were talking to, they were desperate to have help and seek guidance on what was happening and how they were doing it. But what we realized is as they were talking to us about the shocks and the stresses they were dealing with one week, the second week we talked to them, they were already workshopping solutions or options with their teams. The third week we talked to them, they had already implemented those solutions, were trying and tweaking and modifying them, and already dealing with another wave. And we got them to realize that they were practicing resilience. And as a result of this, that experience kind of rippled across the project and the participants. The resulting report that we delivered, which I would encourage all of you to read on our website, not only captures the lessons for leadership on the importance of resilience, but it also captured a real-time archive of leadership insights during this crisis. And for us, something really interesting came out of it, which is a belief that there needs to be a new kind of leadership to create genuine resilience, whether that be in a city, a society, or a corporation. And it cannot be assumed It needs to be learned. This had a profound effect on our work moving forward, which resulted in the creation of a new standalone entity that we launched at the beginning of this year, Resilience Rising. Resilience Rising is a global consortium that convenes essential communities of practice to collectively address major societal challenges and improve the resilience of core global systems by building capacity, advancing thought leadership, and advocating for change. Now, in the context of deep uncertainty and complex interconnected challenges to be faced together, our leaders must both be resilient and be able to lead for resilience. An urgent shift in both leadership approach and human behavior is needed if we are to successfully navigate the challenges and create a safer, more equitable, and prosperous way forward now and well into the future. We must bring together and galvanize these communities that will be essential to the transformation of our core systems. Operating under a common vision, Resilience Rising and its consortium of organizations will collectively work to connect these communities, to advocate for and develop new knowledge, models, tools, and practices that will make our world more resilient. Society deserves a safe, sustainable, and resilient world. The public is now calling for it, and future generations will depend on it. We must build collective will and act now over the next 10 years to achieve it. No one can solve this on their own. The decisions we make today will influence our ability to thrive tomorrow. Thank you.